King Solomon is renowned for his enormous and profound wisdom, which, of course, extends well into the knowledge of the occult. Famous in legend for his binding and control over demonic forces, employing them to even construct the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon would come to be attached to a wide range of magical practices, most infamously those contained in the Key of Solomon literature. These magical texts haunted the libraries of the medieval world. They earned the ire of the Inquisition, who hunted them and burned them. And they survived and they thrive into contemporary magical practices of the occult all over the world today. From the Testament of Solomon stretching all the way back to the early centuries of Christianity, to the use of the Goetia, or the Lesser Key of Solomon, by Aleister Crowley, Solomonic magic is one of the longest standing traditions in the history of Western magic. But what are its origins? What are the earliest texts in this tradition? What do our earliest texts of Solomonic magic even look like? In this episode, we're going to explore a collection of Greek magical texts that bridge the world of late antique pagan and Jewish magic as they flourished first in their Byzantine setting before setting the stage for Solomonic magic generally in the Western world. The Hygromancy of Solomon, a work originally consisting of astrological, planetary magic invoking angels and demons, along with the occult virtues of plants, words, and stones, but eventually coming to include a wide and enormous range of magical rituals, techniques, regalia, divinatory techniques, including good old-fashioned necromancy, along with spells for invisibility and, of course, finding buried treasure, all of which would set the stage for what will become the most infamous form of sorcery in history, Solomonic magic. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica. You can check out my other content, including curated playlists, and I'd hope you consider supporting my work of making scholarly and free content on topics in esotericism here, freely available on YouTube, by taking a look at my Patreon with a one-time donation. You can pick up a cool shirt from our merch store, or with the Super Thank options that you can find below the video. All those links are below. But now, let's turn to the Hygromancy of Solomon and the foundations of Western ceremonial magic. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most striking and frankly impressive aspects of the history of Western magic is just how much continuity exists in the practice, stretching back into the world of Greco-Egyptian magic and the famed Greek magic papyri, all the way to the practice of contemporary ceremonial magic. Now, that's not to say there's some unbroken tradition or a perfectly preserved lineage of practice or anything like that. But a great deal of the techniques, the symbolism, and the procedures remain remarkably consistent through the ages, despite, again, a real wealth or problem of internal diversity. One of the foundational elements of Western magic, then, are those linked with the ancient Israelite king, King Solomon. Of course, Solomon was long associated with ritual power, especially exorcism and demonic binding, along with occult knowledge of nature long before the rise of Christianity. From Philo of Alexandria to Josephus, the Roman writers that wrote about him, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, this reputation extended all the way south into Arabia and is found in the Quran. This would come together in an ancient legendary text in which Solomon is said to have bound demons in the construction of the Jerusalem temple, the famed Testament of Solomon. Now, while the Testament itself isn't a magical handbook per se, it forms the core of the demonology that would feature later in magical systems and already hints, at least in the direction of magical practice. And that's especially true of the sea recension of that text. Now, I've made an entire episode on the Testament of Solomon, which serves as a kind of companion, a pretty important companion to this episode, but I would check it out if you haven't seen it already, although I will say that this episode stands alone just as well. Thus, with Solomon at the center of magical practices in the ancient legendary narratives, from exorcisms, demonic bindings, and the occult properties of nature in the early years of the Common Era, we should be wholly unsurprised to see magical narrative descriptions of his magical practices give way to full-blown manuals for actually practicing the magic that he allegedly did. Indeed, some of this is already hinted at in the Greek magical papyri. For instance, at PGM 4, 850 through 929, we have a technique called Solomon's Collapse. This seems to be a kind of spell to induce a magical ecstatic trance, along with mentions of Solomon's seal and his ring, perhaps, in connection with an exorcistic spell at PGM 4, 3007 through 86, along with several other mentions in the works of people like the Roman Jewish historian Josephus. Again, all of this sets the stage for what seems to be inevitable: the production of a singular text entirely dedicated to the magic practiced by Solomon. And surprise, surprise, that's indeed precisely what we get in the Hygromancy, or the Hygromanteia of Solomon. Like many historical magical texts, the history and recension process of this magical treatise is profoundly complex, positively tortured, as they say, but that's never stopped us before. So let's dive in. And right at the beginning, we get our first mystery. The title of the text is the first mystery that we encounter. Depending on the recension, goes something like: the little key of the whole art of divination through water, discovered by several craftsmen and the holy prophet Solomon, in which he seems to write about this to his son Rehoboam. Other editions have something like the Talismanic Treatise, or simply the Epistle to Rehoboam from Solomon. It's kind of underwhelming when you get down to it. The general title Hygromancy is perplexing, given that it means something like divination by water, but specifically means divination perhaps by moisture. And this is even more ironic because no such technique occurs in either the older macroform, which we'll talk about in a moment, or the many microforms that come to be joined to the macroform of the text. Now, it's possible that this was originally there, that spell was originally there, either as a literal divination by moisture or water, as part of angelic or demonic summoning ritual, or it was just lost, and so the title stuck, but the spell was lost, or Hygromancy means something non-literal in this sense, in the same way that necromancy sort of became a general term for black magic in the Middle Ages. Though titles of text and the stability of those titles weren't nearly as much concern for ancient literature as they are for us. But the title does introduce the main literary framing of the text, which is a letter or a teaching from King Solomon to his son Rehoboam, in which he bids him to master astrological magic, specifically in connection with the occult powers of what he says are plants, words, and stones. Another title of the text actually captures another dimension of the book a little better. It's there, the beginning of the astrological treatise of the Congregation and Edition of Spirits. Here focusing on the invoking not only of the 7 planetary spirits, but also a positively giant array of angels and demons, depending on the nature of the magic one wishes to yield. As you might imagine, you use the angels to do good stuff and the demons to do bad stuff. As we have it, the text survives in about 18 late classical, Koine, and more medieval Byzantine manuscripts from the 15th to the 18th century, thus testifying to its popularity. 18 manuscripts over several hundred years is not nothing. It's typically bundled together with other astrological, medical, divinatory, or otherwise magical texts, especially the Testament of Solomon, as mentioned earlier, which makes sense because the Testament of Solomon is kind of the prologue to all this. It appears to have originally been composed in Koine Greek, probably originally in a highly syncretized, urbanized Jewish or Jewish Christian milieu, sometime in the 5th or the 6th century of the Common Era, although scholars really don't know exactly. The astrological influence may very well point to an earlier, originally Egyptian, perhaps even specifically Alexandrian center of production, although literarily it bears some resemblance to the Horologium of the Testament of Adam. This is a Syriac text of a slightly older period, 2nd to 5th century CE, part of which describes which creatures praise God at every hour and how they do so, along with a pretty detailed early angelology, which actually had a massive impact on Western angelology more generally. In fact, there's a direct line from the Testament of Adam to Pseudo-Dionysius. In fact, the Testament of Adam needs a whole episode on its own. Another possible influence would have been works of elective astrology of that time, especially something like that of, Heliodorus, which also allows one to determine which planet rules at a very given hour, whether that planet is good or evil, malefic or neutral, and what kind of actions one should do at a given hour given those astrological conditions. Though while these may be influences, the Hygromancy is certainly its own text, it has its own inner logic and its own magical aims. And finally, the text itself seems to be composed of 2 distinct layers, the planetary angelic demonic system of the conjurations and the occult properties which form the core of the text. We call this the macroform, along with a collection of magical accretionary material. This material varies widely in the manuscript tradition, but includes a wealth of magical instructions, divinatory techniques, ritual attire, weaponry, means of evocations, and of course fun spells for things like necromancy and treasure hunting, all of which, though in various diverse forms, will go on to become part and parcel of the variable totality of the Solomonic magical tradition. But to see how this is all built up, how it's all put together, it's best to start with the primitive macroform of the Hygromancy, and then to see how elements of the microforms, these smaller magical ritual units, are kind of bundled up with it, and how all of this goes into building out the highly diverse, yet not random or just arbitrary world of early Solomonic magic. The macroform of the Hygromancy is remarkably logical and pretty well preserved, although not complete, as we'll see, presenting a nearly complete system of compact planetary angelic demonic evocation. Following the introduction featuring Solomon providing his knowledge to his son Rehoboam, the text then details the days of the week, starting with Sunday, and going through which planet rules every subsequent hour of that day, beginning at dawn. This logically also dictates the kind of actions one should do or one should avoid doing during that hour, including things like holding conversations, when to do business, tackling lawsuits, hobnobbing with the rich and the powerful, doing alchemy, going to battle, learning things, dreams, when to have good dreams, prayers, taking wrath on one's adversaries as one does. This is all typical D&D stuff that we just do all the time here at Esoterica. Of note is that Friday is referred to as the day of preparation, and Saturday is known in the text as the Sabbath, all very Jewish in their denotation. And yet at the same time, Sunday is also called the Lord's Day, which is Christian. And this is all the while invoking kind of quasi-pagan names for planets and their powers. So, yeah, it's magic, so hella syncretism. Next, Solomon lays out the angels and demons, which also track to each hour of each day in a very vast array of angels and demons. Now, some of these angels and demons are pretty well known, Gabriel and Raphael and all the normie angels. Some of them are downright mysterious, and then others show evidence of Italian influence on the Greek, perhaps allowing us to further dial in the geographic location, or at least the development of this text. Of course, you need both angels and demons, depending on what you're going to be doing with them. Again, if you're going to be dealing out weal or woe, wrath on your enemies. Demons. It's finally worth noting that some of the lesser-known demons in this text also appear in the Testament of Solomon. Remember Ornias, the pedophilic demon that started the whole business in the Testament of Solomon, it actually reveals the fact that he's here in this text. It just kind of reveals some early intertextuality with the field of Solomonic magic already in this very early stage of its development. Now, following the long angel-demon array, which varies from manuscript to manuscript, as we should expect, we're then told by Solomon via Rehoboam that we must utter the prayers of the planets at the appropriate hour, obviously, followed by the adjurations to the proper hourly angels and demons as well. The prayers of the planets invoke associations typical of the planets from classical astrology, but they also include a list of secret names for each planet, because of course they do. This is then followed by an adjuration of the angels and demons, followed by the magical symbols, or the characteres of the planets. These are very typical of late classical magic. Each planetary magical symbol is really a kind of talisman, and it has specific instructions for the construction of that talisman, invoking various kinds of inks, including blood of animals, various surfaces to write out these symbols upon, including a range of creatures' flesh, including the flesh of a vulture, along with various other ritual fumigations, including incenses that are specific to each planet. Now, for anyone that studied much in the way of medieval Solomonic magic, this should all start sounding pretty familiar, even the sort of vague necromancy like you find in CLMA 49. The last two sections describe the various plants of the zodiac and their magical medicinal powers and the techniques to prepare them, along with a similar section on the plants of the specific planets, again, along with their magical and medical powers and the techniques by which to prepare them. Remember, it's about the occult virtues of things found in nature, though it's worth mentioning that the names of the plants here are much more typical of something like 1st century denotations of those plants, as you find in something like Dioscorides, rather than later Byzantine or their medieval equivalents, thus again testifying to the relatively early dating for the composition of this text. All in all, despite lacking a section on the zodiacal and planetary stones, recall that Solomon was to teach Rehoboam about the occult powers of plants, words, and stones. There's no stones here. The text, as I've mentioned, is a quite compact and relatively complete system of astrological evocation, including angelic and demonic conjuration. It includes a whole system of talismanic production and the occult virtues of at least plants. But also remember, the planets also have some nomina barber associated with them, so that might be the magical words that he was mentioning. The system looks remarkably like the magical text of the Greek magical papyri, although tighter, more systematic, and compact. As it stands, again, lacking a discussion of the occult virtues of the stones, the microform of the Hygromancy of Solomon is truly the earliest known text of Solomonic magic and the foundation for what will become a great deal, maybe the majority of the deal, of Western ceremonial magic, Beatrix being accepted here. Though it's worth mentioning that among the earliest texts of natural magic in early medieval Western Europe, they would fill precisely that whole gap of the occult properties of stones and gems. I think maybe even to fill the gap of this text at some level. It's amazing how obsessed they are in the early Middle Ages with the occult powers of stones and gems. Now, with the macroform described, that leaves the smaller ritual literary units which came to adhere to the core macroform text for us to discuss, well, now. The development of the microform accretions around the structural core of the hygromancy makes sense for a lot of reasons. The first is simply the logical result of actually asking how one does the techniques of the hygromancy, of the macroform text, and recording the results of those very experiments. Or just suggestions about how to do this in the manuscript tradition. How does one prepare parchment? How does one sanctify the various elements of these texts? How do you make the incense, etc.? It's a forensic question, and those commentaries often get built into these magical texts. Secondly, innovations upon the macroform based on active experiments with it, but also the inheritance and the incorporation of previous forms of magical practice. The hygromancy didn't develop in a vacuum. It's also going to hoover up older magical traditions. For instance, the development of specific magical attire and protective circles was a mainstay in ancient magic, and thus its eventual incorporation into the performance of the evocation of the macroform rituals makes complete sense. It's a totally reasonable accretion. I mean, do you really want to summon a bunch of angels and spirits without a protective circle? Further, reasons could also include just interest in specific spells. Who doesn't like love and treasure and divination and invisibility? These are all perennially popular, even now, hence their eventual inclusion. Finally, there's just a whole layer of accretionary material, just sort of rando occult stuff, because, well, while you're at it, add stuff. So you get trapping demons in bottles, you get an evocation of a kind of mountain fairy princess, and of course you get some, good old-fashioned necromancy along that expands even the astrological magic of the microform. We get an entire lunarium in some of these microforms. I mean, who doesn't like a good lunarium? As you can imagine, the manuscript recension history is varied and diverse, and honestly, its distribution is pretty poorly understood to this day. However, that the material in the microform and the microform, those layers are a bit scattershot, especially the microforms in the textual tradition, shouldn't be at all surprising. These texts were never meant to be polished, systematic treatises in the way that perhaps a philosophical treatise or a poetic text were. They were practical manuals, and as such, they were destined to dramatically change through time, and they were put into practice and revised based on that practice. This isn't the corruption of a once pure text. This is a living text born of ritual practice and revised as a result of precisely those practices. Further, they're often copied in the particular interests or even the religious commitments of a given practitioner. Thus, the edition that one wizard, one goess produces will vary, sometimes dramatically, from another said wizard or goess. All of which is independent of the fact that who knows what manuscript they even had access to begin with. It's not like this is the kind of thing you could just go and get. These were somewhat persecuted manuals of magic. Though all of that is not to say that the distribution pattern is somehow totally random. No, there is a clear Solomonic field of magical theory and practice for which there is a relatively stable distribution of the microform accretions. Thus, a great many manuscripts will contain descriptions for the production and use of things like ritual items, because you need to know how to produce things like richly fit quills or reed pens, richly fit knives, parchment, or how to, obtain the correct blood to write the planetary sigils. Also, unsurprisingly, the use of magic circles is not uncommon in this text. Magical circles are perennially popular going back for millennia. Without a doubt, the most famous object described in these microforms is the Ring of Solomon. Known since antiquity, Josephus even describes a Jewish ritual expert driving out a demon before none less than the Emperor Vespasian using a Solomonic ring. The ring appears in about half of the extant manuscripts. Unsurprisingly, who doesn't want a boss Solomonic ring? Even now. Interestingly enough, it's first described as being made in virgin wax, covered with virgin parchment, which is written upon with various sets of magical words or nomina barbara, and then worn on the index finger of the right hand. It's a wax ring, first and foremost. Though later texts will have it cast in silver, now with the symbols being carved upon its bezel with the knife of art. Oh yeah, you got to know how to make the knife of art. Later, still versions have the Seal of Solomon taking the form of a simple pentagram or hexagram. The Star of David, by the way, or the Magen David, the Shield of David, doesn't become a symbol associated with Judaism for centuries after the production of the Hygromancy. However, numerous, widely ranging so-called Seals of Solomon also develop and are associated with this ring all through this period and all the way till now. One of the earliest examples of those are found in a manuscript containing both the Testament of Solomon and the Hygromancy, along with a boatload of other cool Greek magical texts. That seal from Harley 5596 is rather unlike the seal that survived in any of the Clavicula Solomonis literature generally, or the seals that most folks are familiar with from the Mathers edition of the Key of Solomon. Though, it is one of the earliest attested, so if earlier is more magically, then go early. Now, which one of these is the most authentic? That beats the hell out of me, but this does show the stability of the microforms, at least in one sense. Interest in the Seal of Solomon is early, and it persists into the contemporary period. Yet, the mutability of the tradition, hardly any two seals are actually the same from manuscript to manuscript, and there are at least a dozen set of magical words, or nomina barbara, and various symbols associated with those that are said to feature on the ring throughout the range of the manuscripts. That's why I think it's important to think of Solomonic magic as a genre of literature rather than a strict magical tradition in any strong sense of that word. Along with the ring, there are other very popular microforms. The conjuration of the 4 demonic directional quarters, while not part of the primitive macroform, was very clearly popular in the early manuscript history, and it endures into contemporary occult practice, the calling of the 4 watchtowers. However, other occult techniques occur only in a plurality of text, and others occur only once. They're sometimes idiosyncratic to a specific recension, or even to a manuscript. Nevertheless, the general distribution of the macroform and the majority of the microforms do, in a substantial sense, coalesce into a singular, distinctive form of ceremonial evocatory magic founded on astrological timing, employing a range of ceremonial rituals and trappings that are now clearly recognizable as Solomonic magic through and through. Thus, it's probably somewhere in southern Italy, perhaps Sicily, that the Hygromancy of Solomon leapt from its origins in Greco-Egyptian Byzantine magic into the Latin world, into the Latin tradition, the world of Western Europe, thus setting the stage for the whole Clavicula Solomonis tradition, or the key. But hear the word, clavicula, sometimes little key, lesser key by the 17th century. Recall that the Greek text often refers to itself as a kleidion, a little key as well. And that little key has come to be both feared and praised in the history of Western occultism, from the manuals of the medieval Inquisition to the novel grimoires of the 21st century. If you want to study a scholarly reconstruction of the macroform of this magical treatise, the earliest primitive version of it, the best place to do that with a brief but helpful introduction is in the volume of Old Testament pseudepigrapha in the edition of Toihano, who also has one of the best academic studies in the development of the Solomonic magical legend, especially its development in the occult world. That text is Solomon the Esoteric King, published by Brill. So here's to your save and throw against poverty. Another truly wonderful edition is by Marthakis, and this text really dives deeply into the manuscript variations, especially of the microform material, with really amazing illustrations, comparative charts, and helpful notes throughout. That's a great foreword by Stephen Skinner as well. It's a fantastic text and well worth looking, especially if you're interested in the practice of this material. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge. Thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.